I would say that the guys who actually excel as athletes, they're about the process of learning and less about like what kind of reward. They're not about the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. They're about the rainbow.
Podcast Junkies episode 211. Welcome back. I'm Harry Duran. This is the conversation you've been waiting for, and you're waiting for it every week. If you're looking for conversations with amazing podcasters, is what I mean. Last week, we had the opportunity to speak to Amira Valiane. She's the co-founder and CEO of Glow.fm. It's a Patreon alternative specifically for podcasters. They're doing some really interesting stuff in the space. They're leveraging the fact that you can actually use your podcast app to solicit a donation, recurring or one-time, from your listeners. Everything happens in the podcast app, even the payment and the redirect to the new feed for people that sign up. So it's really, really intuitive, really cool. Check out glow.fm. Once again, we are brought to you by the Scarlett 2i2 sound card by the wonderful folks at Focusrite. Shout out to Dan Hewley. Can't say enough good things about this sound card. Super clean preamps, which provide a clean boost to your sound. So I've used it both with the Samson Q2U microphone as well as the Shure SM7B, which is a bit gain hungry and definitely requires a clean sound card. So this is the new 3G, third generation sound card, and it's guaranteed to make your audio sound completely professional. Head on over to podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite to see the beautiful landing page they created for the latest line of sound cards. This week I get to speak to Mark Sullivan. He is the host of the Snowboard Project. Shout out to Stephanie Lahart for making the introduction. He's definitely an OG when it comes to media. He's worked on a couple of magazines. He's actually commentated on several Olympics. He's got a really funny story about what happened at the most recent one. Make sure you listen in for that. It's a great story about resourcefulness and just his history as a snowboarder and some of the interesting things he did when he got his show started. You won't believe how many episodes he actually started with. It's amazing and inspiring. So this is a really fun interview. His energy is really great. I really have fun in this conversation with Mark. If you haven't already joined, fans of the show can stay on top of the latest episodes and comment on guests at the Podcast Junkies Facebook group, so make sure you join there. This episode is also brought to you by FullCast, our full-service done-for-you podcast production agency. If you need help starting a show or have some consulting questions related to your existing show, feel free to set up a free chat with me at fullcast.co/chat15. That's chat15. Make sure you stay to the end of the episode where I reveal this week's retention hashtag. But for now, let's hit the slopes with Mark. So Mark Sullivan, host of the Snowboard Project. Thanks so much for joining us on Podcast Junkies.
Thanks for having me.
We were connected through Stephanie Lahart. Is that correct? Yeah. How do you know Stephanie?
Yeah, totally. We got it talking about, I don't know how we met initially, but we got started talking about podcasting, and we just got this back and forth going, and then I ended up sending her a copy of the little book that we made, and so we just are podcast buddies.
What's interesting, and I don't know if you've seen this also in the snowboarding community, but the podcasting community, I've been in it for 5+ years now. Like, we go to the conferences, we all like to help each other out. We all are cheering for each other's shows, and we try to like make a lot of these, cross connections as much as possible.
It's funny because I've been involved with media from the snowboarding side for a long time, and we were always competitive with like our competitors, right? We always saw them as like our competition. And in the podcast world, it seems like more like we have camaraderie and we're supporting each other. And I actually talk to all the other podcasters who operate in the action sports space, talk to them as well. And so we try to give each other advice and, talk about all sorts of stuff. So I'd say, there's more camaraderie than competition as compared to some of the other, media ventures I've worked in.
Have you heard of Shelby Stanger? She's the host of Wild Ideas Worth Living.
I've heard the name and I've heard of the podcast, but I haven't listened to it. I'm really busy with I end up I put out 2 shows a week, so I don't listen to a lot of other shows. Yeah,
just thought you might have crossed paths. I helped her launch her show, and it got picked up by REI.
Oh, cool.
Which is pretty cool.
That's probably where I've heard of it.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of threads to unpack here with your life, because it seems like you've got a couple of varied interests. So let's start with probably the common thread through all of it is the snowboarding.
Yeah.
So how were you introduced to that? And do you remember your first introduction to the sport?
Sure. I mean, it's basically, ever since that first day, I was 14 years old and I was on my family's first ski vacation out west. We went to Jackson Hole and I broke my skis, and I was like, oh, do I go telemark skiing or do I go snowboarding? And so I went snowboarding because it was more affordable, and for the rental equipment, less equipment to rent. And like literally from the first day I was hooked, and I was like, this is what I want to do with my life. And my parents were like, yeah, 14-year-old kid, whatever. You can, you'll figure out you're going to want to be a doctor or a lawyer or something one day. And I just never looked back. And so I became, at a fairly young age, a sponsored athlete. And so I had, companies supporting me, and I would go to events, competitions. Eventually got to the point where I was kind of like filming for VHS videos, that kind of thing. This is like prior to DVDs even.
Yeah.
And just like kept following it. But then my dad told me, and as I was trying to pursue this like professional snowboarding career, my dad was like, look, your brain is smarter than your knees. And, one day I got hurt. I think I separated my shoulder and I was laid up for 6 or 8 weeks. And I was like, I think actually he might have been onto something there. Yeah. Because, no one's going to tell a teenager, what's up. But eventually it sunk in. And so I got an education, never gave up on the snowboarding, and then eventually got into the snowboarding media. And so I worked in like print publications and a little bit in television as well, on behalf of snowboarding for, after I graduated college.
Yeah, you had a hand in a couple of different snowboard magazines, right?
Yeah, I mean, I actually started making my own mags. I got my hands on like a media kit from like the biggest mag, and I was like, wait a minute, if I could do this myself, I'm going to be rich. And so I just started. I didn't know anything about like desktop publishing, which was like new at the time.
Yeah.
Prior to that, everything was done with like page layouts or whatever, paginations, or I don't know.
PageMaker. I used PageMaker back in the day.
No, I had like PageMaker to start, and then it took years. And then Quark Express, then InDesign eventually.
Wow, that's right, Quark Express.
But I had to teach myself. I had to make like every mistake in the book, and so like I remember I published this one mag, and I went to a trade show with the first one, and I made like 1,000 copies of my first little quote unquote zine. And I went to this trade show, and like literally I distributed all 1,000 copies in like 2 or 3 hours. And it was like, oh, you're onto something. And like everywhere you look, there were people looking at it. So I was like, okay, cool.
That's cool.
And then, I went to do another one because there was like some momentum that had already been built. And so I made a second one, and this one wasn't black and white. It went to color. Well, little did I know about like color correction or how, scanning worked, any of that stuff. Didn't know anything. I was just like, yeah, we'll just make a color magazine. No problem. So make this color one. I remember going to the printing house. This time we printed 10,000. And so I go to pick it up at the printer, the first copies, and the guy's like, oh man, looks like you guys are having a lot of fun in the mountains, And I was like 18 years old or something at the time. And he's like, yeah, but I just wanted to ask you, how'd you do your color correction? And I just remember looking at the guy and being like, what's color correction? And so, that pretty much set me off on this path. It's like, okay, so you may have this passion, but like, you're going to want to put some kind of like, some kind of education, something behind it, because it's like, I spent thousands of dollars printing this zine that really, I mean, there was no color correction. I didn't even know that term existed. And so like all the colors were dark and it looked basically terrible. And so that's when I kind of decided that I would go back to school, finish up school. I was kind of like splitting my time between being a sponsored snowboarder and going to college. And then I was like, okay, I'm going to finish school. I'm going to really learn how to make magazines. And so then I went back to college, made a magazine while I was going to college, another one. And then basically by the time I graduated college, I had like all the other existing magazines wanting to give me a job. So I actually had 3 job offers from 2 magazines when I graduated. Wow. So, and then I moved to California and never looked back.
What year was that?
That was like 96 I graduated college. So yeah.
I get the sense of just from the couple of stories you've already told that you're a bit of a do-it-yourselfer, like kind of figure things out as you go along.
Very much so, and for better or worse these days, because I think that I mean, I did go and work at Snowboarder magazine, which is like part of Surfer Publications at the time. We went through 4 or 5 ownership changes in the 7 years I was there. But, I learned how kind of the pros did it. But then, of course, I went back out on my own and started another magazine a few years later. And that was pretty successful as well. So I've always had this kind of thread of entrepreneurship as well as, trying to also push myself. I always kind of use that idea of like constant progression. And so that's kind of really the one thing beyond snowboarding that like can tie to every part of my career is this idea of Kaizen or constant improvement. And so looking at what you did in the past, refining it, and then trying to make it a little bit better each little baby step of the way. And so if anything, I would say that is really the thread that ties everything together is the idea of improving. And so snowboarding, it's tricks, but in publishing, it could be distribution, it could be sales, it could be how you write a story or lay out a page or whatever. So lots of different aspects. Podcasting, of course, is a whole different set of challenges.
Yeah.
So.
Where'd you pick up the Kaizen? Is that something you picked up when you were in school? Or?
Yeah, I learned that in business school. I was going to college, and it was like, I believe it was a business philosophy that we actually brought to, I think McCarthy brought it to Japan after World War II. And so, the little story they teach you in the marketing textbooks is like, they took this idea of Kaizen and they went from making a maker of like, cheap trinkets and toys in Japan to being like one of the best quality manufacturers in the world. And that's based on this idea of Kaizen. So like companies like Honda went from making lawnmowers to scooters to motorcycles to cars based on the philosophy of Kaizen. And so it's funny. I've actually done a couple of interviews where it's like literally like, I'm interviewing the person and they're like, and I have this one philosophy that I follow and it's called, and I'm just like, Kaizen. And we both say it at the same time, and it's like we just like have this like moment where we stop and like it's like literally like the needle comes off the record. It's like, you too? Oh wow. So yeah, I'd say there are people out there who follow that philosophy, and it's been successful for me as far as just having the reward of like knowing that I'm not just like doing the same thing I did in the past and sitting on my hands or whatever. I'm always trying to progress myself.
Is that a trait that runs in your family, or is there anyone that you remember as a mentor that you looked up to who kind of was working that way or was inspiring you?
Yeah, I mean, my dad was like my big inspiration. So my dad was a guy who was an orphan growing up, and then he ended up forging his birth certificate to get into World War II. And he got stationed in Pearl Harbor, and he went and did the whole World War II thing. And then he got out, and he was a fairly smart guy, and so he ended up going to Columbia University and graduating from there and having a pretty successful career, but it was always kind of on his own terms. He ended up becoming a lawyer and basically had his own law firm. He worked for other firms, and then he had his own law firm. And so he just told me when I was like probably 8 or 10 years old, like, hey, if you're working for someone else, you're making that money. And so, I've always had that in the back of my head, I guess. And I'm kind of like, Dad, damn you. Because it's like, it's so much easier to not have to worry about how every single bill is going to get paid and when you're collecting or selling or whatever. There's a lot more moving parts than just like, I just do, just stay between the guardrails, do a good job, go as fast as you can. And that'll be enough. With entrepreneurship, there's a lot more to it.
Yeah, I've done the hybrid, I guess, because I was in corporate America for 20 plus years, and it's very telling that one day where you look in your account and that direct deposit check no longer appears in your bank account, your paycheck. That one day that happens, you're like, oh, okay, yeah. I'm responsible for my own well-being.
Yeah, and so I've been on that track now for, like 15 years. I've been like making my own paychecks happen. So, I've started businesses and run fairly, different size businesses throughout that time. But yeah, for 15 years now, I've been relying, on myself basically to make it work.
Talk a little bit about the current state of print. I don't know how involved you are with that, but I'm wondering, people in this day and age, I think still even have dreams of running a magazine, and it's, sometimes even when you think of newspapers, you see some of these movies glamorize it, some of it. So I'm wondering for listeners who've maybe had ideas of it or have thought of working with that, what's the current state as far as in terms of like if it's still viable?
That's I'd say that print is on the ropes, so to speak, as far as like as a medium, and it's because of the cost of like having like the physical product and having to create a physical product and distribute the physical product. There's a lot of expense, and so when I first got into magazines in the 90s, it was like still, magazines really were like a primary form of media back then. And I would say almost they're secondary today. But back then, you would have like your subscribers, your distribution, right? Or your subscribers and your like newsstand sales, and then your advertising sales. So you had like 3 revenue streams. Well, with the internet and the ability to disperse content or whatever more freely, distribution has actually gone from a revenue stream to an expense. And so now you actually pay for your subscribers. It's like, $9.99 for a year's subscription. It's like it actually costs them $2 a copy to fulfill that subscription. And then, like newsstands, like, okay, airports, that's a good place to have a magazine, but it's like, yeah, they charge you like $1,000 an airport to put your magazine out there. So you better ship them a lot and you better sell a lot at the airport. So really the only way to make money is with advertising. And so what we've seen, beyond the actual business model changing, is the editorial model has changed. It used to be in my days like this idea of church and state, where it's like, okay, the editorial is not affected by the advertising. And they're two independent kind of different things. And so today it's like, because the only form of revenue comes from advertising, the barrier between church and state has really been broken down. And so now you'll see more than ever this kind of pay-for-play content and less of this like investigative journalism or people really doing deep dives and trying to uncover facts or whatever. It's more like they're just a different kind of springboard for their advertiser, right? And so I just think the role of media has changed. And also, by the way, like kids don't read magazines. Like I have kids. They don't read magazines. Like I was in the business for like my whole career, and it's like you put a magazine in their hand, they like look through it and they're like, what do I do with this? You're like, hey, you're going to have to go to the bathroom sometime. They're like, I could be on my phone in the bathroom too. And it's like,
exactly.
Well, that's gross or something. I don't really have a good reason. So go figure. Yeah. But yeah, magazines, I'd say are they need to reinvent themselves basically to be valid today.
What would you say from the years you spent working in the print industry is something that you took away as far as a lesson learned or something about how to do business or something that you still carry with you to this day?
Just the ability to make mistakes and to, not let them be mortal wounds, right? And it's like that first color correction, that was a big mistake, right? Yeah. And like I was so green and so keen on being involved with magazines, but it really was like a true and big mistake. And so I've been willing to, go charge headlong into whatever venture and be willing to make mistakes and learn from them and adapt. And so that's kind of part of that Kaizen philosophy, but really just the ability to be willing and to embrace mistakes, the whole time. And I've made big ones. I've made little ones. I probably make some every day. So there you go.
I'm assuming you built up a nice relationships with, readers, sponsors, those through all the years of doing that you probably still maintain today.
Yeah, I'd say, it's always been in this one kind of niche category.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of some of the readers, were following me back in the magazine days are now listeners today. A lot of the advertisers, even though some of the people changed, the brands are still the same and I still have connections throughout them. So certainly, I've been able to maintain connections, in there, but that also puts kind of like a burden on you to be like, you've already set a standard for yourself and people have this expectation for yourself. So it's not like you're coming, out of left field, and people already have this preconceived notion of what you're going to do, what you're going to make or whatever, versus like being someone who, I'm kind of envious a little bit about people who can come out of nowhere and just be like, hey, I got this idea and here's how I'm going to approach it,
Help me with the timeline, because after you did that and then you were still in the snowboarding, you at some point you also started commentating on some of the events as well, right?
Yeah, that was pretty early on, actually. I started commentating, professional events, I want to say in like the late 90s. And so basically I was at a professional snowboarding event. I was working for Snowboarder magazine at the time, but there was like one of the kids' dads commentating, and he was like, and Jimmy and Johnny went out on Saturday night and they got in trouble. And I was like, give me that thing. That's called a McTwist. That's a 540. And I just started calling tricks. And then, the guy who was running the event was like, hey, you're pretty good. You want to do some more of that? And like, it just happened because I was like, this guy was like, basically just not commenting on the actual like tricks and the competition, the things that I appreciated, right? He was not commenting on. He was just kind of giving some little stories or whatever. And so ever since then, I just kind of snowballed. And then, in 2002, I announced the Olympics, and then I've worked in television as well. Just basically more behind the scenes actually than in front of the scenes in television, but certainly I've had some pretty exciting adventures based on just being involved in different aspects of the media.
What's one story that comes to mind?
Oh, man, there's lots of them. I mean, I've been to 5 Olympics. So here's one from the last one. This is so when you first go to the Olympics, your first Olympics, you're like, oh man, it's like a lot of pressure and the whole world is watching, so I can't mess this up. Well, you go to 4 or 5 and you're kind of like, okay, I know that, like there's perimeter security everywhere. I'm going to have my credential, never take it off. There's certain like rules you start living by, like literally I'm sleeping in my credentials or whatever. So anyhow, at this last Olympics in Korea, the last one I went to, I have access to almost everything. It's like literally when you have a television pass, it's like an Affinity pass, you can go anywhere. So I was over at the Germany house. And so the Germany house, like every country will have like a house where they have their local cuisine and like the Germany house, their Oompa band or whatever. They try to bring like a flavor of Germany, and every stereotype of German culture is embodied in this one house. Same thing for France, Italy, every
so a lot of bratwurst and beer.
Exactly. And it's all free, right? If you can get in. And so anyhow, I ended up losing my wallet at the house. I had a backpack. I had to put it through security, and for whatever reason, I lost my wallet, all my money, all access to money. And so people who I'm working with, I was working for Eurosport Television, but they're like, oh my God, what are you going to do? How are you going to figure? I'm like, you know what? Actually, I'm just going to go with it. No, they're like, let me lend you some money. I'm like, no, I'm going to see how I can make the Olympics work with no money. And so basically I went for 10 days to the Olympics with no money whatsoever, zero cash. God. And I had a credential which could get me food, right? I could eat, and I had a place to stay already. But literally my experience just got better and better and better because people are like, oh my God, you're the guy who lost his wallet. Oh, here, we should take you to this party over here. You're going to want to go see this because, oh, I feel so bad for you. Come with us. And so, like, I just got all these doors opened up for me. Wow. And so for 10 days, I didn't have a penny. And then, by the end, I was like, okay, I'll borrow some money. Now I got to bring some souvenirs home for my kids. But I was like, you know what? It just goes to show that, like, you can make it work if you want to. So, yeah, there's one story. I mean, that's one of many because I've definitely, just being a snowboarder, you're kind of like flirting with the edge of rules, let's say. Yeah, that's true. And so, being someone who's got an infinity pass at the Olympics and someone who's used to flirting with rules, that's someone who can really utilize an infinity pass to its full advantage.
Well, it sounds like you took it almost as a challenge. Like when you saw the situation you were in and someone initially they started offering the money and you were like, well, it's almost like a little life experiment.
Yeah, I mean, it was. And you know what? I mean, I did have a safety net there. I had a place to stay and I could go get food. So it wasn't like fully like being thrown out on the streets and being like, okay, figure it out. But it was still another challenge. But that, that was based on a bunch of other things that I had done at other Olympics. Like, okay, let's see where this pass takes me. And oh, wow, I can go have a beer with the commissioner of the NHL now. And I can get into here. I can go anywhere. And so let's see, where I can go and check it out. So I've had some pretty cool experiences at the Olympics and something that, I cherish anyway, as far as like, it may not pay a ton, but it certainly makes you a richer person for the experience.
Oh yeah, that's one of those lifetime experiences.
Yeah. So,
did you have a lot of opportunities to engage with the athletes? I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to that. We produced a show for someone who's on the 2008 gymnastics team, Samantha Peshek, and so I have a lot of admiration for literally what it takes to be the caliber of an athlete that gets to that, top percentage of a percent that you're performing basically at the top of your game. And I'm wondering if you've got an idea for what that was like, having been to all these Olympics and the caliber of these athletes.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. I mean, even starting at the Snowboarder magazine days, I mean, I started off as an athlete, so I had an appreciation from that. But then I ended up becoming, within a couple of years, the editor-in-chief of Snowboarder magazine. So I was right on the front lines with every athlete, the rider of the year, the video part of the year, all those things. Like, I was dealing with that and kind of shepherding that process along a little bit. And then at the Olympics, basically I would interact with all the athletes, and even like at the last Olympics, I was the guy who, for Eurosport television, which goes to 48 countries, I was the guy who did the corral interviews for all the snowboarders and skiers. So for like 16 events, win, lose, or draw, I was one of the first interviews that you gave. And so I would get like 2 minutes with each person, just to speak with them about whatever. And so whether it was like, okay, they delivered on the expectation, they failed to deliver, it's like there's no thrill of victory without the agony of defeat. So I tried to always play those kind of different cards and tell those stories. So yeah, I definitely have been involved with the athletes, the whole time, I would say. In fact, that I would say I'm more closely tied to the athletes almost than the business side. Now, granted, I've taken steps back over time, just depending on my role, whether or not, I'm going to be involved, as much with the athletes or more with like the marketing guys, the people writing the checks. But certainly I've always had some kind of relationship with the athletes. And I think that's reflected, in the people that are in the podcast too. Like I have like the future Olympians, the guys who qualify for the next one, they're on the podcast, and the guys who've won the gold medals, they're on the podcast too. So certainly, I have leveraged my contacts. It's definitely based on a network that I've spent 30 years establishing.
That's a good segue to jump into the podcasting. But one last question on the athletes and the mindset. You've spoken to folks who've actually made it and been to that level of the Olympics, and then people that, for whatever reason, don't have what it takes to get to that level. Do you notice something in like those two types? Like, what does it take? Because there must be something special to actually get to that level.
Yeah, they floss their teeth. No, I don't think there's actually anything that's like, I would say that the guys who actually excel as athletes are guys who really care less about they're about the process of learning and less about like what kind of reward. They're not about the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. They're about the rainbow.
Oh yeah.
And so the people who I think are successful are the people who focus on those like incremental baby steps to get to that point. And eventually it's like, oh yeah, and we got a gold medal for you too. Right? It's like that is like the result of all of those little baby steps. But the people who are sitting there and be like, oh man, I wish I could win a gold medal. It's like, those are the people who aren't going to win the gold medal. It's like for the people who just focus on the act of doing it and the passion for the sport, those are the people who end up succeeding as far as athletes go.
Yeah, I think that bodes well or it's good advice for people in life as well, and entrepreneurs. I think that applies. Yeah,
it probably does. Like if you don't enjoy the doing of it, if you're just looking at the end result, you're probably not going to get there actually, because there's a lot of work that goes into it.
So the way you're painting the picture is really interesting, because you've got this culture, this ethos of like do it yourself, learn something new, jump into it feet first. Then you get the opportunity to follow your passion, which is snowboarding. You grab the mic from your friend's father, and you start broadcasting and learning as you go. And then you get to start having all these great interviews and learning about how to have an interview, because I'm sure the first, your most recent interview doesn't sound anything like your first interview.
Oh no. I mean, not even from the magazine days. It's like now, I mean, really the Olympics are the thing that interviewing people for TV and having that one chance where there's like interviewers from every country, right? All the way down in this like thing called the mix zone. And when you get your chance and like there's the gold medalists and they're coming, okay, you're next. You got like, and it's like literally you could see the countdown because they're like interview here. Then they go to the next person, they get interviewed there. Like, okay, I'm next. Oh man. And it's like, you cannot mess this up. You will not get a second chance. And so that's kind of the thing that like made me realize, and doing that then over 16 events for the winners and the losers and everything, it like actually gave me like a new skill, like a force, like literally just that, like being on that edge and that pressure of like literally you will never work again in 3, 2, 1, go, right? And like having that pressure, like and doing that like so many times, that gave me the confidence now to walk into any interview and basically do it with little to no preparation sometimes. I mean, literally, like some of these athletes, like, hey, some people are surprising. You had no idea. They came out of left field. You had no idea who they were. They were unexpected. And so you got to be able to handle them as well. So, yeah, I definitely learned some techniques there that I apply now more that I didn't know when I was doing like print interviews, because it was like, oh yeah, you just record the interview and then you edit it together, you transcribe it and edit it, and so it doesn't have to be this like one question is a building block from the last question, which has to tell a complete story from start to finish. So I would say that it's actually like television, podcast, those interview skills are vastly different than the ones that I learned in the 90s working in print.
When you have that short of a window, do you have a goal in mind? Like, if I can ask the one question that will get me this, or I mean, because otherwise you just sound like every other interviewer. So, did you start to hone or a thought process for like, or some sort of method that you came up with that was at least got you something that was hopefully different than what your colleagues were asking? Yeah,
I mean, I would say that I was able to. Basically, I came up with a new technique, which I refined, and I'll share it with you, because podcasters look out for each other, right?
Of course. Yeah.
So here's the thing: is like I developed when I'm interviewing people, I have like this hamster wheel in my head that's like kind of thinking about like where I'm going next.
Yeah, we all do.
Yeah, and so what I did at the Olympics, because of the pressure, and literally it just like was something in me that broke, but basically it broke, and there was a second hamster wheel there spinning. And so now, I have two hamster wheels going in my head at all times, basically, when I'm interviewing someone. And one hamster wheel is like listening to what they're saying and intentionally just listening to what they're asking me or what they're saying. You know, I'm interviewing them usually, and so they're telling me something and I'm trying to listen to that. And then the other one is what I call the batter's box hamster wheel. And so what I'm doing there is I'm just basically practicing questions. And so I'll just take like something they say, I'll stick a hook in it and pull it over to the other hamster wheel. So it's like, oh, and then I broke my leg. And then it's like that goes over to the other hamster wheel. And I'm like, broken leg, broken leg, broken leg, broken leg on this hamster wheel. And this one's still listening to them telling you about their broken leg or whatever, what effect it had. But I'm practicing questions on the other one to be like, okay, now how do I ask this question? And so I'll literally take from whatever they're saying, and basically my follow-up question is almost always based on something they're saying right now in that moment. So it always almost sounds conversational, right? In that I'm always taking something they said and then framing that into the next question. And so basically I would go into all these interviews at the Olympics. You have 2 minutes, so that's 2 or 3 questions. I'd go in with one question, and then I would just sit there and try to pull something over onto that other hamster wheel, and then I'd just start swinging on questions in that batter's box, like, okay, broken leg, was it hard to come back? How long did it take you? Like, you know, it's like, what is that question that's going to be the follow-up based on what they're actually telling me right now? You know, or maybe they mention their family, and so you're like, okay, well, what role did your family have in this? Or, you know, it's always like taking something they said and then figuring out and just like practicing questions enough as they're still talking. You're practicing these questions, so when they're done, you can give them that next question. And, you know, in 2 or 3 minutes, it's like, and with that pressure, you know, it's hard and easy because it's like over. Like once it's begun, there's only 2 or 3 questions. It's only 2 follow-up questions. But when you can do it for an hour and a half or 2 hours and just sit there and people are like, wow, it just seems like you guys were talking. It's like, oh no, that was a hard one. that was not easy.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And usually there's a lot of research that goes into it too, where you're like, okay, I know kind of like, as I'm pulling these ideas from one wheel to the other, I kind of know enough about it where I can ask a suitable question about that subject.
It's a skill. It's active listening. I think a lot of podcasters take it for granted. I've just designed to be a student of the interview process itself. I'm fascinated by people who can conduct long form interviews. Joe Rogan does 3 hours, or even like what you said is another skill. The fact that you get 3 minutes or 2 minutes, that's a whole nother skill set. And the fact that there's so much happening in that process, it sounds exhausting to the listener. I'm sure that like, wow, all these things are happening in the span of 2 minutes. But I think you take so much pride in what you do, it sounds like, that you're conscious of just making the most of the time you have. And also, I think as a listener, sometimes I listen to podcasts and I always want the host to ask that follow-up question, and sometimes when they don't, I'm like, oh man, I wish you would ask them about the leg.
Yeah, and I don't think there really is like a set formula for it. But here's one other thing that I do that I think is probably a good tip for interviewing, right? Which is like, so as part of this last Olympics, I was working for Eurosport, 48 countries, like I don't know how many languages. So not everyone has great English, and I that's my one and only language, basically. I speak some German, but English. And so what I realized is like not everyone would understand the question. And so what I got to the point where I would ask a question in two ways. Like I would ask it like the most direct way, and then I would kind of explain it in like the long format question ask. So like one would be like, like how do you celebrate your victory? Okay, now that all the pressure is off your shoulders. So if they're if English isn't their first language, you actually give them time, even if they heard it in the first part. Like you give them the question really quickly, but then you give them like about 10 seconds of like reiterating the question to like think about their answer. And I've actually found that handy even if English is the first language, because it's like if you're going to ask someone a hard question, you kind of boom, you put them like right up on the head, you give them that tough question, but then you like just restate the question just to allow them time to think about it.
Yeah.
Instead of like, how did that change your life?
Go.
Go, yeah. So...
yeah, it gives them that a little bit of a runway there to think about their answer, and so and also fills dead space. Obviously with podcasts as well. If people like hear silence, they think like, oh, did I lose the connection, or did something happen, or it wasn't edited properly, or something like that.
Yeah, so those are like kind of like the two techniques that I use, and certainly that like double ask the question is something to allow your people to just think for a second. And it also, by the way, eliminates like some of the type stuff. I did one interview, it was 2 hours long. I edited out over 10 minutes of ums. So
yeah, we've all been there, definitely.
Yeah.
When did podcasting make it onto your radar?
Well, I've known about it for a long time, but I would say so. A few years ago, I built this cabin in Alaska. It's like a remote cabin. I think it's like the best place in the world to be a skier or snowboarder, but that's just a personal opinion.
Well, thanks to you, I now have a cabin in Alaska hamster wheel on the side, but go ahead.
Yeah, so anyhow, but there's no electricity, there's no running water, but there's a place I can walk to that has Wi-Fi, and so like how do you entertain yourself, having to walk to your Wi-Fi connection, then walk home and entertain yourself for 8 hours? Well, that's really where I discovered podcasting, and I knew about it, I'd listened a little bit, here or there, but it was more like a side thing. But then once I was like downloading, like 4 or 5 hours of podcasts and listening to 4 or 5 hours a day, hanging out in my cabin in Alaska, that's really when like I became like a true fan. And then Rogan, just the way that like he would, like I had worked in media for a long time and I'd worked in all sorts of formats, but actually I'd never worked in a format that was like 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours, right? Like a print interview is essentially like a magazine feature, like a print interview in a magazine is essentially the transcription of a 20-minute conversation. Right. And so what I realized is like even an hour interview, that's like 3 times as long as like a major interview in a magazine. So it's a different kind of format. But the fact that like Rogan could like just peel back so many layers, like layer after layer after layer, I'm like, this is something new. This is something actually different. This is more in depth and I'm actually getting more out of this. And that's when I was like, okay, this is actually like almost a richer form, richer media content, because it's like, okay, yeah, you can see people, and like magazines are visual, action sports are really visual in their nature, but actually this is a way to kind of like get to a deeper level. And so then I did that for a while, and that's kind of like Genesis. And then within 6 months of then, I was like really kind of trying to figure it out in earnest, And so I just knew about, doing interviews, already had the experiences with the Olympics and stuff. And so kind of had some interviewing technique and just started conducting interviews, and then heard about pod fading. And so I did 40 or 50 interviews before I even launched.
Wow.
And that was like a really good time, just like when I was racking all those interviews, because no one had any expectations of what it was or what it would be. And so they were pretty easy and open to it.
What year did it launch?
It launched in 2018.
In 2018,
so,
okay.
Yeah, it's been about a year and a half or so, but certainly it's been full time and then some.
Was there anything about the medium itself that you were surprised by, or that was something new that you had to learn? Because obviously you had the contacts, you had the experience interviewing, you had this DIY ethos, so you had all the parts. Was there anything about podcasting itself that you were surprised by or had to learn?
Oh, I think the audio stuff has been a huge challenge just to learn about, and editing. I mean, I could edit film and stuff, so I knew kind of conceptually timelines and that, but just learning about the editing and like the audio quality and how to reproduce, audio. And then, this year it's been more about producing remote interviews. And so I do a weekly news show. And so something I'll do is like pull in people from all over the world. And, on one news show, I'll have like 7 interviews from 7 countries and just kind of pull in the news of snowboarding, almost like your, CNN type news show where they have like the talking head or whatever. And so I'll check in with people all over the world to get firsthand reports of what's going on the ground. So that's been kind of like, different. And then I would just say the freedom of format, the fact that like there aren't these like hard set rules, which is like, heck, in television, it's like, okay, is it, if it's a half-hour show, then it's 22 minutes of content or 44 minutes of content or whatever. It's like there are these set formats and you stick in these between these guardrails. Well, with podcasting, I feel like there aren't these guardrails in place, not hard and fast guardrails anyway. And like, one of the big things has been like figuring out how to monetize it, and so it's like the numbers are there, and we should be able to monetize it. But I don't want to work with brands that are not. I'm working with endemic brands to snowboarding, right? So the board manufacturers, the clothing manufacturers, the people who sell lift tickets. Those are the people that I want to work with, not like the. Oh, here's your, vitamin water or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm working with like endemic brands. I'll probably have a beer brand at some point because hey, who doesn't like a cold one? But anyhow, that to me was like that's when I really realized how like the name of my business is Uncharted Waters, but really trying to monetize podcasting is what taught me how uncharted these waters really are. Because people in the action sports world we don't do old-timey radio ads. And I'm like, old-timey radio ads? You have realized what kind of targeted audience I have, and how much they engage with this?
I think they're starting to wake up to it, because it's also the ability to you tell me how you can effectively measure the ROI of your ad on a radio or in a magazine spread, as opposed to I'll tell you, because maybe you use a code or something like that people are listening and taking action from my ad read about your product on my podcast, and this is what it's turning into. Yeah.
So that is something that it's definitely uncharted water still, because we're still working out kind of like how to I would say that's the biggest challenge, is like not producing the audio, not making the content or getting the interviews. It's the monetization of it and getting the brands to understand the value of it. And so last year we did like a Patreon only model, and that didn't bring in enough revenue really to justify the effort anyway. And so this year we went to actual advertising spots, and I would say that it's still kind of a work in progress, but it's also, because they don't know what they're getting into, we've also had the freedom on our side to create whatever kind of ads we want to see what kind of works. Yeah. And so, I've done everything from ad reads to like interviewing their top pro athletes to interviewing company owners to give, like I did this like one ad campaign with this brand Never Summer where literally I interviewed people who work on their factory floor, and just to give people like this idea that like, hey, this is something that like it's made in America and you can really believe in this brand, and these people, 60 families rely on this brand or whatever. And so that was like an ad campaign where I do like a minute interview with like all these guys who like work in a wood shop, basically making snowboards.
Nice.
And I thought it was cool and different, but like, if you were in print, you're like, okay, here's like the guardrails. Now you have a sponsored athlete. The guy's like has all these like trophies and medals and won the X Games. And so people look up to him. And it's like, there's like more set ways to do it. With podcasting, I feel like there aren't really as many accepted ways to do things. And like good audio, I think people can agree is accepted. But beyond that, I don't know that there's a lot of hard and fast rules. And to me, it's like the first podcast I got into, Rogan, was like that broke every media rule I know. I mean, it's like how often does he put them out? Whenever he likes. How long are they? However long they're going to be.
Yeah. And mostly like, always 3 hours. Yeah, I think he's the beauty of what he's repeatedly said is that he's the station owner, he's the marketing manager, he's the editor, he's the producer, like he's the booker, like he literally controls every aspect of the whole program, like we all do with our shows, right? So we can decide what the rules are, and as long as your audience is resonating with what you're producing, that's really all that matters, because that's all you're beholden to, like the people who are actually listening week in and week out to your show.
Yeah, and my guess is anyway that people want to hear different stuff. If everyone, if everyone looks at Rogan as like, let's copy Rogan, then it's like, well, how do you play foil to that? How do you create something that's like, I mean, there's like 3 rules in marketing, and that's like my background. When I went to college, I did go for marketing, but it's like you're the leader, the low cost provider, differentiated. And so, being the fact there's 500,000 to 700,000 or more podcasts out there right now, it's like really the only terrain that you're going to be able to take if you don't have the backer of some big podcast network or someone really putting some funding behind you. You're not going to be a leader, and you don't want to be a low-cost provider, because I think everyone falls into that trap of like, hey, I make podcasts for free because it's a hobby. But it's like, how do you make something that's both compelling and different, something that is going to inspire an audience to want to tune in week after week, but also be different than the other options they have in those categories? Like I operate in wilderness and sports or whatever, and like in that category, or comedy or tech or whatever. You want to be different.
Yeah, and I don't know if you've heard of Pod News. It's a daily newsletter about the podcasting industry.
I do, but it's like 2 minutes long, 3 minutes long. It's a good one, because it's like it doesn't take up much time, and so it's like okay, 2-3 minutes, I'll get plugged in with things daily, and so that makes me rethink what I'm doing. I mean, I do a news show once a week right now, and I'm wrestling around with this format right now because it's hard to get the news and the interviews I want to get from all over the world in less than an hour and 45 minutes. And it's like, but I don't believe for a minute that people have an hour and 45 minutes to tune into the weekly snowboarding news, unless you're one of those 1%ers, right? The 1%ers, sure. But like, I think that there's got to be a more palatable way to do that. And you look at Pod News, and certainly they have a different approach.
Yeah. How did you decide on the format? Because I noticed that you have a tip line, so people are calling in on that as well. And you also have a co-host, Dustin? Yeah,
I got a co-host, Dustin. And so, I would say right now, like I have basically like 2 shows a week right now. One is an interview show, traditional kind of long form interview. So it's just basically a conversation, and that will cover people. I mean, I've interviewed everything from like an 18-year-old kid who 10 years from now will be the most famous, snowboarder in the world. Like he's literally, I did an interview with him the day he signed his first pro contract, and I was like, okay, this is, I'm putting my bets on green right here. So anyhow, I did like that. And I also did like the vice president of marketing for Nike. So those are like two totally opposite ends of the spectrum. One guy's redesigning NFL uniforms, and the other guy's like, I don't know what my favorite music is, because if I state it right now, people are going to judge me in the future for that. Right? And so it's just like for opposite ends of the spectrum. Yeah. So that's one show is like the open format interview, and the other one is like news show. And so we're actually still playing around with the format for that, and that's really evolved. The news show started out as just like me and my co-host just talking about the news back and forth. And then we started pulling in remote interviews. And then we started doing things where like, okay, well, we're going to have two kinds of remote interviews on our news show. One is like a 2-minute check-in. What are the snow conditions? What just happened at your local resort in Poland or in Japan? And, and the other one's like more like a deep dive, like, hey, you just put out a movie last week. Let's talk about behind the scenes of the movie. And that's like a 20-minute interview. And both of those will be in the same show. So we're still working out the news show formats. But that's kind of the beauty of it. It's like we take our feedback, and some people like it, and try to balance all the feedback we get and keep modifying it. It's like we don't know where the final format will be, because there is no accepted format. It's like if you're going to do if you look at like the news shows on like MSNBC or CNN, it's like they're 80% the same and 20% different. Yeah. And so right now I feel like we're in a point, at least with podcasting, where you can literally just go in all different directions and see what works. And that to me is exciting.
Has the tip line been helpful for folks to either give you feedback on how the show is doing or just provide content for the show?
Not as helpful as I would like. I mean, I think it could be better utilized, and I think that we could do a better job as far as like when we promote it. Some shows will put it like literally right at the end. So if you're the person who listened to like the last minute, okay, then you'll hear it. But I think if we were more consistent in our feedback on that, a lot of the feedback we get on the tip line is just like, oh man, I'm stoked. Brad, or something like that. So, have you looked at SpeakPipe? It's a way for it's basically the same concept, but they can use a browser, so they just push a button and they record right into their computer, and it sends it. You can do up to 3 minutes for free. Speakpipe.com. Okay. And then you can just grab the snippet, because you don't have to deal with like the phone and stuff like that. So if you want to and then edit it into your shows, it's pretty cool. I mean, the tip line I'm doing is basically just goes to a Google voicemail. Okay. So it goes into a Google Voice. They just basically, and it says like in the message, it doesn't actually ring to my phone. It goes to like, hey, you've reached our tip line. Leave a message here. We'll get a recording of it, whatever. So it gives us an MP3, not a WAV, but that's fine. What's got you excited about the snowboarding industry? I'm sure you're hearing about a lot of innovations happening there as well. The thing is, it's like constantly in flux. So there's a bunch of different things that each have their own tracks. So on the resort track, I would say that there are these like season passes where you get this one season pass that ends up being good at like 20 resorts. And so the trend there is that people are able to buy one season pass and like be a Mammoth local, but then also go to Whistler, go to Jackson Hole, or go to other resorts. And so we're seeing, I think one is the Icon Pass, the Mountain Collective, and the Epic Pass. And those ones basically have had people kind of traveling more and exploring more areas. So that's an exciting trend, especially in light of the fact that like Vail had like a $217 day pass over Christmas break. It's like, who could even afford that? Anyway, and so I would say that's exciting that people, who get to the point where they're good snowboarders or skiers can get a pass that can actually allow them to check out lots of different places, experience the adventure that goes beyond, to me, snowboarding is more about doing tricks or turning. It's about the adventure of going to new places and meeting new people and different cultures and all of that. And so we definitely try to promote that. From the snowboarding product side, there are certainly, incremental innovations. I would say the biggest innovations happened in the 90s, but really anytime there's, something to talk about with product innovation, I think that, those are just exciting little changes that happen every year. And like we're getting right into the time where people are introducing next year's stuff. so shops can buy it now and have it ready. So people are talking about that right now. But, what really gets me excited is the act of participating in snowboarding. And so really it's like I watch the weather, and where the weather is good, I know the snow will be good, and then we'll cover it in our weekly show. And so it's really exciting to me that we can pull in people from anywhere in the world. So it's like, wow, they just got dumped on in Russia. And I'll literally pull someone into the show to find out firsthand, to hear it from their voice with their funny accent and everything, what the snow conditions in Russia were like this week.
Very cool.
So that's kind of like the exciting crossover to me between podcasts and snowboarding. Snowboarding is constantly changing all over the world, and it's like, if Instagram is like the ultimate throwaway content and magazines are the ultimate keeper content, that they're a physical thing you put on a shelf, well, podcasts are somewhere between keepers and throwaways. And so to me, it's an exciting format, medium.
Very cool. A couple of questions as we wrap up. What's something you've changed your mind about recently?
Something I've changed my mind about recently. Oh, boy. Well, I would say just in regard to like how we monetize the show, I've had to evolve in my thinking. I had this very egalitarian kind of view of like, okay, we're going to have like only one product category per show, and this is going to be exclusive like this or whatever. And the reality is that the industry isn't up to speed with this being a valuable input. So really it's like the thing that's changed is like, hey, if you're down with podcasting, I'm down with you. Versus like, no, we're going to do this like the right way, only using like the right sponsors who really have a stake in the business or whatever. It's like, you know what, if you're going to believe in us, if you're going to be one of the first adopters of podcasting as a medium in action sports, and we're going to believe in you and figure out how we can help get your brand message out there. So that's something that's evolved.
What's the most misunderstood thing about you?
Most misunderstood thing. I don't know. That my life is a vacation is definitely the opposite of that. It is definitely a lot more work than good times. And though I talk about the fun of snowboarding and something that people see as recreation, it's not 40 hours a week. It's a lot more than that. So.
But I imagine you do it because it lights you up, and you can't imagine yourself doing anything else.
Yeah. I do enjoy it. I don't feel like it's work. It's like, so I tell people, it's like I did have a job in 1994. It was at Pizza Hut, and I got yelled at by my boss to like mop the floor again or whatever. It's like, that's when I had a job, but the rest has been pretty fun.
Very cool. Well, Mark, thanks for this wide-ranging call. I'm glad we got to connect, and I got to hear your story. It's a lot of, it seems like you've led a very exciting life, and you're showing no signs of slowing down anytime soon.
Cool. Well, thank you very much, Harry. I appreciate it. Thanks for putting me on your show.
What's the best way for folks to track you down, to listen to the show, and to connect with you?
Okay, so we're on like all the podcasting platforms. On the Snowboard Project is the name of the show. You can email me if you want to get really direct at Mark, M-A-R-K, at thesnowboardproject.com, or you can even call our tip line, 208-471-8007.
Old school.
And leave us a
love
message there. So there you go. There's 3 different ways.
Well, thanks again. We'll make sure we have all the links to the show and your contact info in the show notes. And thanks for joining me today. Have a fantastic day.
Cool. Thank you, Harry.
So thanks to Mark for educating us on what's happening in the world of snowboarding as I look out the window and it's actually snowing outside from where I'm at right now. I really love the fact that he had all these skills that he picked up along the way. He talks a little bit about obviously the passion for snowboarding, and then the commentating on the events, taking the mic from his friend's father, and then his experience at the Olympics, and then the magazine. It's so interesting to see how he's pieced it all together. And the fact that he launched with 40 plus episodes is amazing, and it's just a testament. And it's something we actually talk about when we talk to clients about getting shows launched and having them in the can, not necessarily releasing them all, but just having them. It's just a stress release. You don't have to be worried about what's coming next. And so he gave himself that runway, which is really amazing. So shout out again to Stephanie Lahart for another fantastic intro. If you'll remember, she introduced us to Scott Gurian from Far From Home podcast. So that was good. Always looking for suggestions for guests. Super interesting. I think you know the flow. I think you know the vibe. And if you know folks that would be a good fit for this show, I'm looking to expand out and make sure I have a consistent stream of great conversations coming your way. And I'm getting really excited about the ones we have coming up. Production and marketing for this episode provided by FullCast, our full-service done-for-you podcast production agency. Music by Cedar and Soil. Check out cedarsoil.com. Thanks to our show sponsor, Focusrite, and their amazing Scarlett 2i2. I almost consider it the industry standard when it comes to sound cards. They've created a nice landing page for details on their latest line. Go to podcastjunkies.com/Focusrite. Tune in next week for my conversation with Colin Morgan, host of the Daily Grind podcast. If you made it this far, the retention hashtag is SnowMark. There's no Twitter account for the Snowboard Project, so just do hashtag the Snowboard Project as well and tag podcast_junkies. Thanks for everything you do to support the show. Have a fantastic week.